In the northern part of Ukraine, near the quiet banks of the Pripyat River, there once stood a bright and peaceful town. Its name was Pripyat, a place that did not exist before 1970, yet by 1986 it was home to more than 50,000 people. It was young, full of life, and full of light. The people who lived there were proud. They were workers, engineers, teachers, doctors, and families. They called themselves the people of the future because they lived beside something that symbolized progress and power, the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. To them, the plant was not something to fear, it was something to celebrate. It brought electricity, jobs, comfort, and hope. Pripyat was different from other Soviet towns. It was built especially for the workers of the nuclear plant, clean, organized, and modern. Tall apartment buildings rose neatly beside playgrounds and schools. There were theaters, shops, and even a small amusement park that was almost ready to open. In the mornings, you could see buses filled with workers driving toward the power plant. They wore uniforms and carried lunchboxes, laughing and talking about the day ahead. At night, the city lights glowed softly, powered by the same plant that stood only a few kilometers away. The people often said proudly, "We light up the country." Children played near the river. Teachers walked home from school. Cafes were busy, and the small stores sold everything from bread to bicycles. It was a town full of youth. Most residents were under 30 years old. Many couples had just started families. To them, Pripyat felt safe, clean, and full of promise. The pride of Pripyat was the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, known officially as the Volodymyr Lenin Nuclear Power Station. It had 4 giant reactors, and each one produced huge amounts of electricity, enough to power millions of homes. The technology used was called the RBMK reactor, a Soviet design that used uranium as fuel and water as a coolant. At that time, nuclear energy was seen as the future. It was quiet, powerful, and, people believed, safe. It didn't fill the air with smoke like coal or oil. It was seen as clean energy, the sign of a modern and advanced nation. In the Soviet Union, progress and technology were matters of pride. The leaders spoke of the power of science and how it would lead the country into a bright future. The workers at Chernobyl believed they were part of something great, a project that showed the world what human minds could achieve. The spring of 1986 came gently. Snow was melting, and the air was getting warmer. Trees began to bloom, and the streets were full of people walking and cycling. In the apartments, mothers cooked soup and prepared their children's school uniforms. The sound of radios filled the rooms, music, news, and laughter. The plant workers were busy too. They worked in shifts, maintaining the reactors, checking instruments, and preparing for tests. One of those tests was planned for reactor number 4. It was meant to be a simple safety test, something that had been done before. The idea was to see if the reactor could keep running safely if power was lost. If electricity stopped for some reason, could the turbines still give enough power for a few seconds until backup generators started? It sounded harmless, even boring. No one could imagine that this small test would become the start of one of the worst disasters in human history. Inside the plant, the control room of reactor number 4 was filled with equipment, buttons, and dials. The workers on duty were experienced, but many of them were young. They trusted the system and followed the rules, or at least they thought they were following them. The man in charge that night would be Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer. He was strict and confident, known for pushing people to work fast and not question orders. He had spent years in nuclear power and believed nothing could go wrong if procedures were followed. That belief, strong and unshakable, would soon be tested like never before. Friday, April 25, 1986, began like any other day. It was a bright and quiet morning. Children went to school, parents went to work, shops were open. The local radio played cheerful songs. In the town square, Banners were being hung for the upcoming May Day parade, a big celebration of workers across the Soviet Union. It was only a week away, and everyone was looking forward to it. In the schools, children were learning math and singing songs about peace and progress. In the hospital, nurses walked through the halls with smiles. No one had any idea that within hours, their lives would change forever. At the plant, preparations for the safety test were being made. It was supposed to happen in the morning, but there were delays. Another power plant nearby needed electricity, so the Chernobyl team had to wait. That delay pushed the test into the night, a time when the main engineers had already gone home and less experienced workers were left in charge. By evening, the test was rescheduled after midnight. The men in the control room were tired, but orders were orders. No one realized that the combination of timing, pressure, and misunderstanding was creating the perfect setup for a disaster. As night fell, Pripyat was peaceful. The lights in the apartments flickered off one by one. Children slept soundly. Some families watched late-night TV shows. Teenagers walked by the river, holding hands, laughing under the soft glow of streetlights. From some apartments, you could see the tall chimneys of the nuclear plant in the distance, lit up against the night sky. It looked calm and quiet, just another night in the city of the future. But inside the plant, something was brewing. To understand what happened that night, it helps to know a little about how the reactor worked. The nuclear reactor is like a giant kettle. Inside, small atoms of uranium are split apart. When they split, they release heat, a lot of heat. That heat turns water into steam. The steam spins turbines, and those turbines create electricity. But because this process is very powerful, it needs control. In the reactor are control rods made of a material that absorbs neutrons. These rods act like brakes. They can slow down or stop the reaction. If something goes wrong, the rods can be dropped all the way in to shut the reactor down safely. In theory, it's a good system. But in reactor number 4, there were design flaws, problems that no one fully understood or admitted. The control rods had graphite tips that, under certain conditions, could actually make the reaction stronger for a moment before slowing it down. That small design detail would soon have deadly consequences. Inside the control room, the men prepared for the test. The test was supposed to simulate a power failure, to see if the turbines could produce enough electricity before the emergency generator started. To do this, they had to reduce the power level of the reactor. But something went wrong. The power dropped too low, almost to zero. When they tried to bring it back up, it didn't behave as expected. The operators were nervous, but Dyatlov insisted that they continue. He didn't want to delay the test any longer. They disabled safety systems, alarms, and automatic shutdown mechanisms, things that were meant to protect the reactor because they believed they were safe. By 1 a.m., the reactor was in a very unstable condition, but no one realized just how dangerous it had become. Outside, the night was calm and cool. The stars shone brightly over the river. In the city, a few lights were still on in the windows. People slept peacefully, unaware that just a few kilometers away, a chain of tiny atomic reactions was spinning out of control. The earth was still. The world was silent. And then, deep inside the heart of reactor number 4, the balance between safety and disaster began to tip. Looking back, it's almost strange how normal everything felt that evening. How peaceful it all seemed. The workers in the control room, tired but proud of their jobs. The families in Pripyat, planning their weekend picnics. The teachers, the doctors, the children, all living in a city built on the promise of human progress. No one could see the invisible danger that was waiting in the dark. No one could imagine that in just a few hours their city would become silent forever. That night, the people of Pripyat slept soundly. They dreamed of school, of work, of vacations, of the future. But as the clock ticked toward 1:23 a.m., inside the control room, a small light flashed on a panel, a warning that was ignored. The calm before the storm was ending, and soon the town that glowed with light would glow for another reason, a reason no one would ever forget.
It was past midnight on April 26, 1986, in the small town of Pripyat. The streets were silent. A cool spring wind blew softly across the empty roads. In the distance, the tall chimneys of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant stood under a sky full of stars. Inside the plant, men in gray uniforms worked quietly. Most of them were tired. They had already been on duty for long hours. But this was the night of the safety test, a test that was supposed to prove how safe and strong the reactor really was. No one imagined that within minutes the world would witness something it had never seen before, a nuclear explosion inside a civilian power plant. At 1 a.m., the workers in Reactor 4's control room began the final steps of the test. The plant was simple. They would lower the power of the reactor, cut off the electricity flow, and check if the spinning turbines could keep the reactor's pumps working for a short time, just enough to bridge the gap until backup generators started. It had been done before at other plants, but this time small mistakes began to pile up. The power level dropped too low, much lower than it was supposed to. At such low levels, the reactor became unstable. It was like trying to balance a spinning plate on a stick. The smaller it spins, the easier it is to fall. The young engineers tried to raise the power back up. They pulled out control rods, the rods that were meant to control the reaction, to make the reactor more active again. But they pulled out too many. By 1:15 a.m., the reactor was in a dangerous state, but the alarms and instruments didn't make it obvious. The screens looked calm, the lights blinked normally, and so they continued. Inside the control room, the atmosphere was tense. Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer, stood behind the operators, watching every move. He was known for being strict and hard to please. "Continue with the test," he ordered. Some of the younger workers hesitated. They didn't feel comfortable with the numbers they were seeing. But Dyatlov reminded them of their duty. They were not allowed to delay or disobey. So they did as they were told. They pressed the buttons, they closed valves, they turned off automatic safety systems that could stop the reactor if it behaved strangely. It was all routine, at least it seemed that way. But deep inside the reactor, the balance of nature and science was breaking apart. Inside the massive steel and concrete reactor, a powerful chain reaction was taking place. Tiny uranium atoms were splitting, releasing energy and neutrons that struck other atoms, creating more heat, more pressure, more reactions, a self-feeding fire at the atomic level. When controlled, this fire gave light to millions of homes. But that night, it was slipping out of control. By 1:22 a.m., the reactor's temperature was rising fast. The water that cooled the reactor began to boil. Steam bubbles formed inside the pipes. In a nuclear reactor, steam bubbles are dangerous. They stop the water from cooling the uranium fuel rods properly. When that happens, the reaction speeds up even more, like a race car with its brakes removed. The operators saw some strange readings on their screens, but they thought it was just a sensor issue. The instruments were not designed to handle what was happening. No one in that room truly knew how close they were to disaster. At 1:23 a.m., the test officially began. The workers closed the steam valves to the turbines, cutting the flow of energy. For a few seconds, everything seemed normal. The turbines spun freely, just as planned. The control room was quiet, except for the soft hum of machinery. Then, one of the engineers noticed something strange. The water flow into the reactor was dropping too fast. Pressure was building. Heat was rising. The reaction was speeding up uncontrollably. At 1:23:40 a.m., the operators finally realized something was wrong. They pressed the emergency shutdown button, AZ5. This button was supposed to drop all the control rods back into the reactor immediately, stopping the chain reaction within seconds. But because of a design flaw, their graphite tips briefly increased the reaction instead of stopping it. In the few seconds it took for the rods to descend, a huge spike of energy shot through the reactor core. A massive burst of energy ripped through the reactor. The fuel rods shattered. Steam built up to enormous pressure inside the reactor vessel, and then it exploded. The first explosion blew the 1,000-ton steel lid of the reactor into the air. A second explosion followed moments later, releasing radioactive material into the night sky. Inside the control room, lights went out. Panels flashed red. No one knew what had just happened. The building shook as if struck by an earthquake. Men were thrown off their chairs. Dust and smoke filled the air. No one could believe that a nuclear reactor, something built to be indestructible, had just exploded. Outside, the night sky lit up with a strange blue glow. People in Pripyat saw it from their balconies, a pillar of light rising from the plant, beautiful but terrifying. At the power station, pieces of burning graphite, the core material, were scattered across the roof and the ground. The alarm rang loudly. Flames were spreading. Smoke carried invisible radiation into the air. Within minutes, the first firefighters arrived. They thought it was just an ordinary fire. They had no idea they were walking into a deadly cloud of radiation. They climbed ladders, sprayed water, and tried to stop the flames. Some picked up burning debris with their hands. One fireman later said, "It felt like metal. It burned through my gloves." The men worked bravely, but what they couldn't see was that the air itself was poisoned. Every breath they took filled their lungs with radioactive dust. The firefighters didn't hesitate. They didn't wear special suits. They didn't have time. One of them, Lieutenant Vladimir Pripyat, led the team to the reactor building. He shouted orders through the smoke, trying to protect his men from the heat. But within hours, many of them would fall sick. Their faces turned red. Their skin began to blister. They were being hit by radiation sickness, though no one knew it yet. One firefighter saw pieces of graphite glowing on the ground. He thought it was just metal and kicked it away. Later, his leg would swell and turn black. Still, they worked for hours. They put out fires on the roof, around the turbine hall, and near the reactor. Their bravery kept the fire from spreading to the other reactors. If those had exploded too, half of Europe might have become uninhabitable. These men didn't know it, but they were saving millions of lives. Inside the plant, chaos reigned. The control room was filled with smoke and confusion. The men coughed and shouted to each other. Meters showed impossible numbers. Some indicators didn't work at all. When the chief engineers called the main control center to report, no one believed them. "How can a reactor explode?" the officials said. "It's impossible." In Soviet nuclear science, reactors were considered perfectly safe. There was no plan for what to do if one blew up. Some workers went to check the damage themselves. They walked onto the roof and saw nothing but a giant hole where the reactor used to be. Flames and debris glowed deep inside. The heat was unbearable. They realized then that the reactor was gone. From Pripyat, the sight was both strange and mesmerizing. People stepped out onto their balconies in the early hours of the morning. They could see a faint blue light rising from the power plant. It was radiation, high-energy particles reacting with the air, creating a phenomenon called Cherenkov glow. To the people watching, it looked beautiful, like the northern lights. Children pointed at it, saying, "Look, the sky is glowing." Parents told them to go back inside, but most didn't understand the danger either. There was no alarm, no sirens, no warning.
The wind carried radioactive dust through the town. People slept with their windows open. They breathed it in, unaware that their lives were quietly changing forever. By morning, the first victims began to feel unwell. Firefighters and workers who had been at the plant felt dizzy and nauseous. Their skin burned. Their mouths tasted like metal. Some began to vomit. Doctors in the Pripyat hospital didn't know what they were dealing with. They treated it like chemical burns or food poisoning, but nothing seemed to help. Still, the city carried on as normal. Buses ran, schools opened, shops were filled with people buying bread and milk. Only a few officials and plant workers knew that something terrible had happened, but even they didn't yet understand how serious it was. Radiation is invisible. You can't see it, touch it, or smell it, but it moves silently through air, water, and dust. At Chernobyl, radiation levels were thousands of times higher than normal. In some places, it was so strong that standing there for just a few minutes could cause fatal illness. The town's Geiger counters, the machines used to measure radiation, were useless. They were designed for small levels, and the readings maxed out immediately. It wasn't just Pripyat that was affected. The radioactive cloud began to move with the wind, spreading over Belarus, Russia, and later Sweden. But for now, in the early hours of April 26th, no one outside Ukraine knew anything. As the sun rose, smoke still poured from the reactor ruins. Helicopters began to circle overhead. The pilots could see the glowing crater, something no human eye should ever witness. The ground crews worked tirelessly, fighting fires and trying to understand what to do next. Some of them knew they wouldn't survive, but they stayed. They brought sand, lead, and boron to dump into the reactor in an attempt to stop the radiation from escaping. It was dangerous and nearly impossible, but it was the only option. The men below watched the sky turn pink with morning light, not knowing that this was just the beginning of a battle that would last for decades. When the explosion happened at 1:23 a.m., it wasn't just a building that broke apart. It was trust, the trust people had in technology, in safety, and in the promises of progress. For the people of Pripyat, it began as an ordinary night. By dawn, their world was poisoned. They still didn't know. Children were playing outside, workers were sweeping the streets. Life went on, but the invisible danger spread quietly through the air, settling on the roads, on clothes, on skin, and into lungs. That night, humanity learned that even the most powerful machines can fail when pride, pressure, and small mistakes come together. The explosion at Chernobyl wasn't just a physical disaster. It was a reminder of how fragile human control really is. The light that once symbolized progress had turned into a deadly glow. And while the people of Pripyat still went about their mourning, the invisible storm of radiation had already begun its silent march. The clock had struck 1:23 a.m., and history would never be the same again. The sun rose slowly over the town of Pripyat on the morning of April 26, 1986. It looked like any other peaceful spring morning. The air was cool, the birds were singing, and sunlight sparkled on the windows of the tall gray apartment buildings. But what people didn't know was that the air itself was now deadly. At the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, only a few kilometers away, a terrible fire was burning. A fire that no one could put out. A fire that could not be seen or smelled. A fire made of invisible particles that could kill slowly and silently. This was not just a fire of wood or metal. It was a radiation fire, and it was spreading through the sky. At first, even the plant workers didn't fully understand what had happened. They knew there had been an explosion, but no one believed that the reactor itself was gone. That seemed impossible. The word meltdown was not something people used. The official belief was that a reactor could never explode. But now, reactor number 4 was completely destroyed. Its core open to the air, glowing red hot, pouring deadly radiation into the atmosphere. Thousands of tiny radioactive particles, iodine, cesium, strontium, and more,
were shooting upward into the sky like smoke from an invisible volcano. They were carried by the wind, drifting over forests, rivers, and cities. The radiation was silent, colorless, and tasteless. People could walk outside, feel fine, and have no idea that they were being poisoned with every breath. By dawn, dozens of fire trucks surrounded the power plant. The firefighters worked bravely through the night, spraying water on the burning roofs and buildings. Some climbed up ladders onto the turbine hall roof, where pieces of glowing graphite from the reactor's core lay scattered. The graphite was so radioactive that standing near it for a few seconds was like getting thousands of X-rays at once. The men didn't know that. They treated it like an ordinary industrial fire. They picked up the glowing pieces with their hands, not realizing they were holding death itself. They worked for hours, trying to stop the flames from spreading to Reactor 3, which was still operating next door. If the fire had reached it, the disaster would have become even greater. Some of the men vomited as they worked. Their skin turned red, and they felt dizzy. Their bodies were already reacting to the massive doses of radiation they had absorbed. Yet they stayed. They kept spraying water, kept climbing the ladders, kept fighting, because that was their duty. The flames that rose from the plant that night were strange. They were not bright orange like a normal fire. They were blue and white, glowing like ghostly light. People from miles away could see them. In Pripyat, residents stood on their balconies and watched the glow. It looked like something from another world, beautiful but frightening. Children pointed and laughed, saying it looked like the northern lights. Parents watched too, not realizing that each minute they stood outside, they were breathing in invisible dust that would stay in their bodies forever. One mother later said, "It was so pretty. We didn't know it was killing us." By mid-morning, the Pripyat hospital was crowded. Dozens of plant workers and firefighters had been brought in. Their faces were swollen, their eyes red, their hands covered in blisters. Nurses tried to help, but they didn't understand what was wrong. No one told them it was radiation. They treated the burns as if they were chemical injuries. When the patients began vomiting and losing consciousness, the doctors realized it was something far worse. Still, they had no protective gear, no medicine that could stop the effects. Many of those first responders, the ones who ran toward the plant when others ran away, were already dying. They didn't know it yet. While the hospital filled with patients, the rest of Pripyat went on as usual. Children went to school, buses carried workers to their jobs, people lined up at shops and markets. The government had not told anyone to stay indoors or leave. The word radiation was not mentioned on the radio or in the newspapers. Officials didn't want to cause panic. But radiation doesn't wait. It moved silently through the air, settling on rooftops, playgrounds, and gardens. It covered clothes and hair and mixed with the dust people walked on. Some children played outside near the river that morning, laughing and riding their bikes. By evening, many of them would begin to feel sick, headaches, nausea, strange skin rashes. Still, no one connected it to the plant. Later that day, Soviet officials from Moscow arrived at the Chernobyl plant. They walked through the site, trying to understand what had happened. Many didn't believe the reports from local engineers. "The reactor cannot be destroyed," one said. "It's impossible." When they climbed to a high point to look at the plant, they saw the truth with their own eyes. A smoking black hole where Reactor 4 used to be. Even then, they hesitated to speak the truth. The Soviet Union was known for secrecy. Admitting such a failure would embarrass the government. So they decided to keep the disaster quiet for now. No evacuation order was given. Pripyat remained full of people, men, women, and children, living next to one of the most radioactive places on Earth. By the afternoon, the fire inside the reactor was still burning fiercely. It wasn't a normal fire that could be extinguished with water. In fact, spraying water only made it worse. The heat was so extreme that the water turned into steam instantly, carrying more radioactive particles into the air. The government decided to send helicopters. Pilots were ordered to fly directly over the burning reactor and drop sand, lead, clay, and boron from the air to smother the flames and block the radiation. It was a dangerous mission. The pilots flew through radioactive smoke so strong that it made their instruments go crazy. Some felt burning sensations in their faces as they flew.
Still, they continued, flight after flight, dropping tons of materials into the crater. For many of those pilots, the radiation they absorbed during those missions would eventually take their lives. As the scale of the disaster became clearer, the government began calling for help. They needed thousands of workers to clean up the site, to remove radioactive debris, build protective walls, and prevent further explosions. These workers became known as liquidators, men who came from all over the Soviet Union. Some were soldiers, some were miners, some were volunteers. They were told they were serving their country, but few were told the real danger they faced. Many were given simple masks and cloth suits that offered almost no protection against radiation. They shoveled pieces of radioactive graphite with bare hands, threw them into trucks, and washed contaminated buildings with hoses. They worked in short shifts, sometimes only a few minutes at a time, because staying longer could be deadly. Even so, many later became sick. Some died young. But their work prevented the disaster from spreading even further. They were heroes, though most of their names were never known. As the fire continued, scientists realized something even more dangerous was happening. Underneath the reactor, the melted core was slowly burning through the floor. If it reached the large pool of water below, it could trigger another massive explosion, one powerful enough to destroy the other reactors and contaminate most of Europe. A group of volunteers, engineers and divers, stepped forward to stop it. They had to drain the water from underneath the reactor. They knew it could be their last mission. Wearing simple suits and carrying flashlights, they entered the flooded tunnels beneath the burning reactor. It was dark, hot, and full of radiation. But they kept going until they found the valves. They opened them and drained the water just in time.
When they came back, they smiled quietly and said, "It's done." Their bravery likely saved millions of lives. For 2 days, the Soviet Union said nothing to the outside world. But radiation doesn't stop at borders. On April 28th, scientists in Sweden detected high radiation levels that could not be explained. They realized something terrible had happened somewhere in the Soviet Union. Only then did the Soviet government make a short announcement on television. There has been an accident at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. Measures are being taken. The situation is under control. But it was not under control. The fire was still burning. The radiation was still spreading. By then, clouds carrying radioactive dust had already reached parts of Europe, Sweden, Finland, Poland, and beyond. Back in Pripyat, the first evacuation order came 36 hours after the explosion. Buses began lining up in the streets. Loudspeakers announced calmly that people should pack a few belongings and leave temporarily. They were told they would be away for only a few days. Families grabbed clothes, documents, and food. Children carried toys. Pets were left behind. As the buses drove away, people looked back at their homes through the windows. They didn't know it, but they would never return. The fire still burned in the distance, and the sky over Chernobyl glowed faintly blue. For 10 days, the reactor continued to burn. Helicopters kept dropping sand and boron. Firefighters sprayed water day and night. Scientists worked to find ways to cool the reactor. Finally, after many dangerous operations, the fires were contained. But by then, tons of radioactive material had already escaped into the air. Forests nearby turned brown and died. Animals fled or fell ill. The river water became poisoned. The land around the reactor, once green and full of life, became silent. It would later be called the exclusion zone, a place too dangerous for people to live. When the fire finally went out, the nightmare had only begun. Tens of thousands of people had been exposed to radiation. The brave men who fought the fire, the helicopter pilots, the plant workers, and the liquidators, many would never recover. But because of them, the fire did not spread to the other reactors. Because of them, Europe was spared an even greater catastrophe. Chernobyl taught the world a lesson that day, that even the most powerful machines cannot be controlled without humility, caution, and truth. The fire was out, but the story of its consequences was only just beginning. For more than a day after the explosion, the town of Pripyat continued to live as if nothing had happened. Children went to school, people shopped for bread, and families walked along the river. But every breath they took, every piece of food they ate, carried invisible radiation, a silent danger spreading through their peaceful town. The sky was clear, the air smelled fresh. There were no alarms, no warnings, and no sirens. Only a faint glow on the horizon reminded anyone that something had gone wrong at the nuclear plant. No one in Pripyat knew that their town had already become one of the most radioactive places on Earth. The morning after the explosion, April 26, 1986, began like any other day. The people of Pripyat woke up early, had breakfast, and got ready for work. The schools were open, the buses ran on schedule, children played in the courtyards, and mothers pushed baby strollers through the streets. Some families noticed a strange metallic taste in the air. Others saw ash-like particles falling from the sky, but they thought it was dust or pollen. No one had ever experienced radiation before. At the hospital, however, doctors and nurses were already growing worried. Firefighters and plant workers who had been brought in during the night were getting worse. Their skin was red, blistered, and hot to the touch. Some had lost consciousness. The doctors suspected radiation, but no one confirmed it. Still, no public announcement was made. The people were told nothing. Radiation doesn't make noise. It doesn't smell. It doesn't sting or burn like fire, but it damages the body from the inside out. It moves through the air, the soil, the water, and the dust. It can cling to hair, clothes, and skin. It can enter the body through food or breathing. In Pripyat, the radiation levels that morning were thousands of times higher than normal. It was as if every person in the city had been given hundreds of chest X-rays every hour. But they didn't know it. Children ran through the playgrounds, laughing under the same soft blue sky that carried death. People ate fruits and vegetables grown nearby. Some even went fishing in the river. The danger was invisible, but it was everywhere. By afternoon, the truth could no longer be hidden. Engineers and military officers at the plant were reporting radiation levels so high that their instruments stopped working. The needles simply jumped to the maximum. Helicopters flew over the reactor and saw the glowing ruins below. They confirmed that the core was completely open and melting. In Moscow, scientists realized that the accident was far worse than anyone had imagined. If the wind changed direction, the radioactive cloud could spread across Kiev and even reach other European countries. The situation was no longer local. It was global. Finally, by the afternoon of April 27th, the Soviet government decided to evacuate the city of Pripyat. That Sunday morning, loudspeakers crackled across the town. A calm voice made an announcement. "Attention, comrades. Due to an unfavorable radiation situation at the Chernobyl power station, the city of Pripyat will be temporarily evacuated. Please take your documents, essential items, and some food. The evacuation will last approximately 3 days." The voice was polite, calm, and careful. There was no panic, no mention of the word disaster. People were told they would return soon, so most packed only what they could carry. Children took their favorite toys. Mothers packed sandwiches and small bags of clothes. Many left their pets behind, believing they'd be back in a few days. Buses from nearby towns began to arrive. long lines of yellow and green vehicles stretching down the main road. Soldiers in masks guided people to the buses. Each apartment block was checked to make sure no one stayed behind. By the afternoon, the whole town was on the move. It was a warm, sunny day. The trees were turning green, and the air was filled with the smell of spring. Families walked to the buses quietly. Some children were excited. It felt like an unexpected trip. Others clung to their parents, unsure of what was happening. Old men stood in their doorways, looking back at the apartments they had just locked. They didn't know that this was the last time they would ever see their homes. Each bus carried about 40 people. Slowly, they began to roll out of the city. From the windows, people could see the Ferris wheel in the amusement park. It was supposed to open for the May Day celebrations in just a few days. Now it stood still and empty, its yellow cabins swaying gently in the wind. Behind them, the city grew smaller and smaller, until it disappeared completely in the distance. When the people of Pripyat left, they were told they would be gone only for a few days, so most left their animals behind. Dogs and cats ran after the buses, barking and crying, not understanding why their families were leaving. Some people threw food out of the bus windows for them. Others wiped their eyes silently. The pets would never see their owners again. In the following days, soldiers were ordered to stay behind and prevent the animals from spreading radiation outside the zone. The homes, too, were left full, meals still on tables, toys on the floor, clothes hanging to dry. Pripyat froze in time, as if everyone had just stepped out for a moment. By evening, all 49,000 residents of Pripyat had been evacuated. The streets were empty. The shops were silent. The windows reflected only the golden light of the setting sun. The city that had once been full of laughter, music, and life had turned into a ghost town in less than 24 hours. Soldiers stood guard at the entrances, and warning signs were placed on the roads. Radiation zone, do not enter. It was the first time in history that an entire city had been abandoned because of a nuclear accident. Pripyat was only the beginning. In the days that followed, villages and towns around Chernobyl were also evacuated. The radiation had spread far beyond what anyone had expected. Farmers were forced to leave their fields and animals behind. Whole communities disappeared overnight. In total, more than 100,000 people were moved from their homes in the weeks after the explosion. Later, that number would grow to over 350,000 as the contamination spread. Many of them were relocated to other parts of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. They were given new apartments, but their hearts remained in the land they had left behind. Some elderly people refused to leave at all. They said, "This is our home. We were born here and we will die here." A few of them stayed in the exclusion zone, living quietly in small wooden houses surrounded by empty fields. After the evacuation, soldiers and scientists entered Pripyat to measure radiation. They found contamination on almost everything, on clothes, toys, books, furniture, and walls. All those objects were dangerous now. They had absorbed radioactive dust. Trucks were brought in to bury or destroy many items. Whole houses were sealed or bulldozed. The streets were washed with chemicals. But even after cleaning, the radiation could not be completely removed. It had sunk deep into the ground and into the buildings. Pripyat became a frozen memory, a place where time stopped forever on April 26, 1986. A large area around the plant, about 30 kilometers wide, was declared the exclusion zone. No one was allowed to live there. Checkpoints were set up. Soldiers patrolled the borders. Inside, nature began to take over. Grass grew through cracks in the roads. Animals returned: foxes, wolves, deer, and birds. Without humans, the forests became wild again. But everything
The trees, the soil, the rivers still carried traces of radiation. It was a strange and haunting world, a beautiful landscape filled with invisible danger. For years after the evacuation, the people who once lived in Pripyat remembered their city with deep sadness. They spoke of the small joys, the laughter of children in playgrounds, the lights of the movie theater, the smell of flowers along Lenin Avenue. Many kept photographs of their homes, the last proof that they had once lived there. Some survivors visited the zone years later, with permission, walking through their old apartments, now covered in dust and silence. A few found the toys their children had left behind, still lying on the floors, small bears, dolls, and blocks, frozen in time. The silence of Pripyat told its own story, a story of human progress, pride, and loss. Not everyone left forever. A few old residents, especially from nearby villages, returned secretly months later. They missed their homes, their gardens, and their animals. They said they would rather die in their own land than live as strangers somewhere else. The government tried to remove them again, but some refused. They lived simple lives, growing potatoes, keeping chickens, and fetching water from wells. Many of them survived for decades. They became known as the self-settlers, a small community of people living quietly in the shadow of the world's worst nuclear accident. When the world finally learned the truth about Chernobyl, there was shock and fear everywhere. Countries across Europe detected radiation in their air, on their crops, and even in rainwater. People worried about food safety, about their children, about the future of nuclear power. Governments began reviewing their safety rules. Some nations shut down old reactors or canceled new ones. Chernobyl changed the world's view of nuclear energy forever. It showed that even one mistake could have consequences that lasted for generations. The evacuation of Pripyat was not just the story of a city being emptied, it was the story of trust broken. People who believed in progress and technology and then were forced to flee from the very symbol of that progress. They didn't run because of war or famine, but because of something they couldn't see, something man-made that turned against them. To this day, Pripyat stands as a reminder, its silent buildings and empty streets whispering to anyone who visits, "Do not forget." Today, Pripyat is still there. The Ferris wheel stands tall but rusted. Trees grow through the floors of old schools. Wild animals wander through supermarkets and apartment blocks. The town remains empty, a museum of the moment when human pride met the power of nature and science. Every year, a few people visit. Scientists, journalists, tourists. They wear protective clothing and carry radiation meters. They take photographs of the city that time forgot. Pripyat is quiet, but its silence speaks louder than any words. The evacuation saved thousands of lives, but it also ended thousands of others. Not by death, but by displacement, by the loss of home and belonging. The people of Pripyat left thinking they'd return in 3 days. It has been decades, and they still wait. Their hearts forever tied to a place they can never call home again. When the fires were finally brought under control and the city of Pripyat stood silent, the world still didn't know the full truth of what had happened at Chernobyl. Inside the Soviet Union, officials tried to hide the scale of the disaster. They didn't want the world, or even their own people, to know how serious it was. They said the situation was under control. They said everything was fine, but the truth was far from fine. The truth was that the explosion at Reactor 4 had released more radiation than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. And thousands of brave men and women were now risking their lives to stop the world from facing an even greater catastrophe. In 1986, The Soviet Union was a country where bad news was rarely shared. Leaders didn't want people to lose faith in the system. Factories, armies, and power plants were all supposed to be perfect, symbols of strength and progress. So when Chernobyl exploded, the first reaction of many officials was not to help the victims, but to hide the problem. The first reports to Moscow said it was a small fire that had been contained. Even when scientists told them that radiation levels were dangerously high, some leaders refused to believe it. The May Day parade, a big celebration held every year, was still planned in the capital city of Kyiv, only a few hundred kilometers away. Even though radioactive dust was already blowing in that direction, the parade went ahead. Children marched through the streets waving flags, completely unaware that the air around them carried invisible poison. For several days, the truth was kept secret. It was not until Sweden, hundreds of miles away, detected radiation in its own air that the world realized something was terribly wrong. On April 28th, scientists at a nuclear power plant in Sweden noticed their radiation alarms going off. At first, they thought their own reactor was leaking, but after checking everything, they discovered the radiation was coming from the east, from the direction of the Soviet Union. They contacted international agencies. Soon, other countries detected it too: Finland, Poland, Germany. Radioactive particles were floating over Europe. The Soviet government could no longer keep the secret. That evening, they made a short announcement on national television. An accident has occurred at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. Measures are being taken. The situation is under control. But nothing was under control. The reactor was still burning, and thousands of people were still being exposed to dangerous radiation. The world demanded answers, but the Soviet leaders gave only silence and confusion. Even scientists inside the country had trouble getting information. While politicians argued, scientists took action. They understood the danger. They knew that if the melted core kept burning downward, it could reach the groundwater beneath the plant and cause another massive explosion, one that might make half of Europe unlivable. A team of engineers was gathered to study the reactor ruins. They worked around the clock, using instruments that barely functioned in such intense radiation. They planned a desperate solution: cool the reactor from below. To do this, they needed to drain the water under the plant and build a tunnel beneath the destroyed reactor to install a cooling system. It was dangerous work. The air was toxic, the walls were unstable, and radiation filled every corner. Yet hundreds of miners and engineers volunteered. They said, "If we don't do this, no one will have a future." A group of miners was brought from the Donbass and Tula regions of the Soviet Union. These were tough men, used to hard labor and dark tunnels, but even they had never faced something like this. They were told to dig a tunnel under Reactor 4 so that a cooling plate could be installed to stop the core from melting deeper into the ground. The work was hot, suffocating, and filled with danger. Temperatures in the tunnels reached over 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick and filled with radioactive dust. Many of the miners worked without protective clothing because the suits made the heat unbearable. They dug with their hands, shovels, and drills, a race against time to save millions of lives. When reporters later asked why they did it, one miner said simply, "Someone had to." Their courage was quiet, but it was the kind that changes history. Above the reactor, another group of heroes worked in the skies. Helicopter pilots flew directly over the burning reactor to drop sand, lead, clay, and boron into the open core. They flew through radiation so strong that it interfered with their instruments and burned their skin through the glass. They made hundreds of flights, risking their lives every time they took off. Each bag they dropped reduced the spread of radiation little by little. Many of those pilots later suffered from radiation sickness. Some died within months, but their actions prevented the fire from spreading further. They were soldiers in an invisible war, fighting a deadly enemy that could not be seen. After the immediate danger was controlled, a new phase of work began. Thousands of men were sent to clean up the radioactive debris, remove contaminated soil, and build a structure to contain the destroyed reactor. These men were called liquidators, a name given to those who liquidate or remove the consequences of the disaster. They came from all across the Soviet Union: soldiers, firefighters, engineers, truck drivers, and ordinary workers. Some volunteered, others were ordered to go. They wore simple uniforms and lead-lined eyeprints, but these gave only limited protection. They carried shovels and metal tools. Some worked on the roof of the reactor for only 90 seconds at a time, because staying longer would mean certain death. They called it the most dangerous job in the world. When robotic machines failed due to high radiation, the liquidators went in themselves. They shoveled radioactive graphite off the roofs by hand, calling themselves biorobots. They were told, "You must clear this much in 2 minutes, no more." They obeyed, knowing that every second could shorten their lives. Many of them later fell ill. But without them, Chernobyl would have continued to poison the earth for generations. Once the debris was cleared, scientists and engineers began working on a plan to cover the destroyed reactor with a huge concrete structure that would seal it off from the environment. It was called the sarcophagus, a name taken from ancient Egypt, meaning a stone tomb. The structure was massive, over 30 stories high, and built with thousands of tons of steel and concrete. It had to be constructed quickly before the coming winter rains spread more radioactive dust. The work was dangerous. Radiation around the site was still extremely high. Every hour spent there meant a risk to life. Yet people kept working. By November 1986, just 7 months after the explosion, the sarcophagus was completed. It was an incredible human achievement, a wall between humanity and the deadly heart of Chernobyl. When it was finished, the workers stood together in silence, knowing they had built something that would outlast them all. For many years, the Soviet government tried to hide the true number of victims. They said only 31 people had died in the explosion and its immediate aftermath. But doctors, scientists, and survivors told another story. Thousands of people suffered from radiation sickness, nausea, weakness, burns, and organ failure. In the months that followed, many firefighters, liquidators, and plant workers died in hospitals, their bodies too damaged to heal. Children born in the affected regions developed illnesses and birth defects. Farmers lost their land. Families were never allowed to return home. Even today, the full number of deaths linked to Chernobyl is unknown. Some estimates say tens of thousands. Others say more than 100,000. But behind each number was a real person, a name, a story, a life. It took years for the truth about Chernobyl to fully come out. Many scientists who spoke up were silenced. Some were punished for telling the truth. One brave man, Valery Legasov, was one of the lead scientists who investigated the disaster. He spent months studying what happened and tried to warn others about the design flaws in the RBMK reactor. But the government ignored his warnings. He was treated like a troublemaker instead of a hero. 2 years later, feeling hopeless, he took his own life. Before he died, he recorded tapes describing everything he knew. Those tapes were later made public and helped the world understand what really happened at Chernobyl. Legasov's courage in telling the truth, even when it cost him everything, became a symbol of integrity and science over politics. Despite all the pain, loss, and secrecy, the story of Chernobyl is also a story of courage. It is the story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Firefighters who ran into flames without knowing the danger. Doctors who treated patients with no protection. Pilots who flew into radioactive clouds. Miners who dug through fire and heat to stop a worse disaster. Scientists who spoke the truth when it was forbidden. They didn't do it for money or fame.
They did it because they knew they had to. Because in moments of crisis, the strength of humanity shines brightest. Today, there are monuments in Ukraine and around the world to honor those who fought the Chernobyl disaster. Statues of firefighters, pilots, and workers stand quietly near the ruins they thought to tame. Each year, on April 26th, people gathered to light candles and lay flowers. They read the names of the fallen and remember the courage that saved countless others. Many of the survivors still live with health problems, but they also live with pride. They know that their sacrifice changed the world. Because of them, the nuclear industry everywhere became safer. Because of them, future generations learned what happens when truth is hidden and mistakes are ignored. Chernobyl took many lives, but it also revealed something powerful: the strength of humanity.
When the fires were finally out and the reactor sealed beneath layers of concrete and steel, a strange silence settled over Chernobyl. The helicopters stopped flying. The liquidators went home. The radiation levels slowly began to fall. But the story of Chernobyl was far from over. The disaster had changed not only the land and the people who lived near it, but also the way the whole world thought about science, power, and responsibility. It showed what happens when truth is hidden, when warnings are ignored, and when technology grows faster than wisdom. Chernobyl became more than just a place. It became a lesson for humanity. For hundreds of square kilometers around the reactor, the earth was poisoned. Fields turned brown, forests died, and animals disappeared. The once lively city of Pripyat stood empty, a ghost town frozen in time. Wind blew through its broken windows. Vines climbed the sides of buildings. Birds nested in schools, shops, and movie theaters. The land closest to the reactor became known as the Red Forest because the radiation had turned the trees a rusty orange color. Many of them soon withered and died. The soil underneath them carried radiation so strong that it would remain unsafe for thousands of years. Farmers who lived miles away had to abandon their fields. Milk, meat, and vegetables from the area were found to be contaminated. Rivers carried radioactive particles downstream. Chernobyl became a wound, one that could not be healed by time alone. Radiation is silent and patient. It doesn't vanish quickly like smoke or fire. It lingers in the soil, in the water, in the air, and even inside the bodies of those who were exposed. In the years after the explosion, doctors began to see the effects. Firefighters and plant workers developed cancers, thyroid problems, and other long-term illnesses. Children who had lived in Pripyat or nearby villages developed thyroid cancer at unusually high rates. Many families lost loved ones to sickness that appeared years after the disaster. Scientists say that some radioactive materials from Chernobyl will remain dangerous for tens of thousands of years. The element cesium-137, for example, has a half-life of about 30 years, which means it takes 3 decades for its radiation to be reduced by half. Even today, the forests and soil near the reactor are still contaminated. If someone digs into the earth or burns the wood, radiation can be released again into the air. The danger never completely disappears, it only sleeps beneath the surface. The official Soviet reports listed only 31 direct deaths, but that number hides the real scale of the tragedy. In the decades since, scientists and doctors have tried to understand how many people truly suffered because of Chernobyl. The estimates vary. Some say 4,000 deaths, others say tens of thousands. Some researchers believe that the real number could be much higher. The truth is that it's almost impossible to know. Radiation doesn't leave clear evidence. It damages the body quietly, cell by cell, year by year. But behind every statistic are real people: firefighters who fought the flames, liquidators who cleared the debris, mothers who carried their children away from their homes, and doctors who treated the sick without protection. They are the faces of Chernobyl, and their stories continue to remind us that the human cost of this disaster can never be measured in numbers alone. Today, the city of Pripyat still stands, silent, empty, and surrounded by nature. The Ferris wheel that was supposed to open for the May Day celebration still stands tall in the amusement park, its yellow cabins rusted and motionless. Schools are filled with dust-covered books and broken desks. Gas masks lie scattered on the floors of classrooms. Apartments still hold furniture, clothes, and toys, just as they were left when the people evacuated. It's as if time stopped in April 1986. Yet nature has returned in unexpected ways. Deer and foxes wandered the streets. Birds nest in old buildings. Even bears and wolves have come back to the forests. The Chernobyl exclusion zone, once considered dead, has become a strange kind of wildlife sanctuary. Without humans, the animals have thrived. It is a haunting reminder that while human life fled, nature slowly found a way to heal. Before Chernobyl, many people saw nuclear energy as the future, a clean, powerful, and almost limitless source of electricity. After Chernobyl, the world saw how dangerous it could be if handled without care, honesty, and safety.
The explosion showed that even a small mistake, combined with poor design and human pride, can lead to a disaster on a global scale. It also showed how important truth is. If the early warnings had been shared, if the design flaws of the RBMK reactor had been admitted, if the operators had been properly trained and informed, the explosion might have been prevented. After Chernobyl, countries around the world began to rethink nuclear safety. Governments introduced stricter rules. International agencies were formed to share information and improve reactor designs. Chernobyl became the reason for a new era of caution. For many years, the original sarcophagus that covered Reactor 4 stood as a shield against the radiation. But concrete doesn't last forever. Cracks began to appear, and scientists feared that radiation might leak again. So, in 2016, a new structure called the New Safe Confinement was completed. It was the largest movable building ever made by humans, a steel arch taller than the Statue of Liberty, designed to completely cover the old sarcophagus. The new shelter was built nearby and slowly slid into place over the reactor. It can last for at least 100 years and allows engineers to safely dismantle what remains of the reactor inside. It was a moment of hope, proof that, decades later, humans were still working to make things right. Over time, something unexpected happened around Chernobyl. The forests began to grow again. Animals returned: wolves, lynxes, wild horses, even bison. Without people cutting trees or hunting, nature began to reclaim the land. Scientists who study the area say it has become one of Europe's largest wildlife reserves. This doesn't mean it's safe. Radiation still affects the plants and animals in subtle ways, but it shows the resilience of nature. Even in the most poisoned soil, life finds a way to grow. Chernobyl has become both a tragedy and a miracle, a reminder of destruction and a testament to the power of renewal. Chernobyl taught the world many lessons not written in books, but in lives lost, homes abandoned, and courage shown. Lesson 1: truth matters. Lies and secrecy made the disaster worse. When people are not told the truth, they cannot protect themselves or others. Lesson 2: nature is fragile, but also strong. Human mistakes can destroy it, but when left alone, it can heal in remarkable ways. Lesson 3: knowledge must serve responsibility. Science is powerful, but without wisdom and care, that power can harm instead of help. Lesson 4: Ordinary people can be heroes. From firefighters to miners, from pilots to doctors, ordinary men and women faced death to save millions of lives. These lessons are not only about nuclear energy, they are about everything humans create, our machines, our cities, our systems. They remind us that progress must always walk hand in hand with humility. Every year on April 26th, people around the world light candles to remember Chernobyl. In Ukraine, survivors gather to honor those who died and those who fought to contain the disaster. Flowers are placed at monuments near the reactor site. For many of them, the memories are still painful: the sudden evacuation, the fear, the loss of home, the illnesses that followed. But they also speak with pride in their city, pride in their courage, pride that the world learned something from their suffering. Chernobyl became not just a place of death, but a symbol of warning and remembrance, a place where humanity faced its own mistakes and began to understand the true cost of arrogance. After Chernobyl, the global community promised that such a thing would never happen again. International organizations were created to monitor nuclear safety. Countries began sharing information more openly. Engineers redesigned reactors to be safer and easier to shut down. Even education changed. Students around the world learned about Chernobyl as a warning of what happens when human error and secrecy mix with powerful technology. The phrase, "Remember Chernobyl," became more than a historical reference. It became a reminder to be careful, honest, and humble in the face of forces we do not fully control. Today, the exclusion zone is both haunting and peaceful. Nature sings again. Birds call, rivers flow, and sunlight filters through trees that grew from radioactive soil. Scientists still visit to study the long-term effects of radiation. Tourists visit too, walking through the silent streets of Pripyat, feeling the weight of history. For many, it feels like walking through a time capsule, a moment from the past that still whispers warnings to the future. And yet, there is also beauty there, a strange, quiet beauty that reminds us that life endures, that the earth can recover, and that even after the darkest night, morning comes. Chernobyl was not just a disaster of science. It was a disaster of human behavior, a mix of pride, fear, and denial. But it was also a story of bravery, sacrifice, and learning. It forced humanity to look at itself, to see how much power we hold and how easily that power can slip out of control. It reminded us that progress is not measured only in technology, but in our wisdom to use it wisely. Chernobyl is, and always will be, a scar on the earth, but also a teacher to every generation that comes after. If we listen to its lesson, if we remember its story, perhaps such a tragedy will never happen again. In the fields near Chernobyl, amidst the ruins and silence, a few small sunflowers now grow. They were planted by scientists and children as symbols of hope and renewal. Sunflowers are known to absorb radiation from the soil, to clean what was once poisoned. They stand tall and bright under the same sky that once carried a deadly cloud. And so, even here, where death once ruled, life has found a way to bloom again. The story of Chernobyl ends not with destruction, but with resilience, a promise from the earth that life, no matter how fragile, will always find its way back to the light.